And so one of my favorite things to do to unwind, to de-stress, to take my mind off things is to play video games. And in particular, sports video games, hockey and football and golf and even wrestling and all of these things. And when my kids were really little, they didn't understand that sometimes they were the cause of that stress that I was feeling. And they would wander over to Dad to want to be with me and to play these video games too. And I didn't have the heart to say no to them or to tell them to go away. So I would sit them down beside me and I would hand them a remote to play along. They would grab that remote with a big smile on their face. They'd mash those buttons down. Sometimes when they were really little, they'd put it in their mouths. They would make me ask which player they were on the screen. They would celebrate goals or touchdowns, telling me what they did to make it happen. They would enjoy that time with me for as long or as little as they chose to sit down. But little did they know I had a secret. Because while wanting to have them around, I really didn't want them to wreck my game. So I would do something that I will say is sneaky at best and an outright lie at worst. My secret was they weren't actually playing the game. The controller I gave them didn't work for that system. Or it wasn't charged, so it would never turn on or light up. My favorite was when video game controllers, and most of the kids won't know this, they came with cords. And I would give them a corded video game controller that wasn't even plugged in to the machine. But they would sit there happily playing along, thinking they were in the game, doing everything they could to control and to get the outcome they wanted, realizing none of what they were doing would work. Now, it didn't take long, some perhaps longer than others, to figure out that this is what was happening. But for a while, my plan worked. They were focused and content, thinking they were in control of the situation. And those are words that I believe can describe the majority of the characters that we've read about in our passage, our Bible passage this morning from Matthew chapter 26. People who entered that night or found themselves in a situation that night doing everything they could to have control over it. Jesus has just prayed, as we heard last week in Joshua's message, for God's will to be done. He had just challenged the disciples, and then he ended the previous section of Matthew 26 with these words, "Rise, let's go, here comes my betrayer." Words that would describe the man who first believes he's in control of that night, Judas. He was one of the 12 disciples, Jesus' closest and most trusted followers, the man who had agreed to betray him, to hand him over for 30 pieces of silver. Now, Colleen shared with us a couple weeks ago that would have been a small amount of money, somewhere between days and perhaps a couple months' wages that he gave over Jesus for. Now, we're never completely sure why Judas made the decision he did. Luke's gospel says Satan had entered into him. Some believe it was choosing what he truly valued most, money over following Jesus. Others believe these were the actions of someone who had given up everything to follow, but who had become disillusioned or frustrated with his teacher because he wasn't the political or military Messiah some were expecting. That this decision was a way for Judas to try to force Jesus' hand to be who he wanted him to be. But what we can see is that Judas was trying to control the situation as it unfolded that night. He arranged the betrayal of his rabbi, his teacher and friend. He planned the time and place where this would happen, knowing Jesus' habits and his schedule. He had even planned out how he would show them which person to grab, that he would offer him a kiss, a special mark of honor from a student to a teacher, but one that would be a slap in the face, a sign of disrespect to Jesus in that moment. Judas putting all of these things in place, believing that they would help him control the situation and make sure that him and those that he'd partnered with would get everything that they wanted out of it. A group of people that, as we continue to read in verse 47, we see were also seeking to control this situation. Matthew records he didn't come alone, but just like the triumphal entry, there was a large crowd that had gathered on that night. A mob of people with swords and clubs sent by the religious leaders in order to bring Jesus to them for trial. They didn't come for him, as he said in verse 55, when he was teaching in the temple, because they knew it would not end well for them. The people were listening would rise up to support him and protect him. Instead, they found one of the disciples to hand him over. They arranged for it to happen at night when the people would be asleep and not around. They sent a group big enough to overwhelm and overpower him and the disciples if they chose to fight back. They've done this in order to quietly put an end to his ministry, to his teaching, to the movement he was creating. They were there to gain control of the man who was wresting control from them one parable at a time, building a following for the kingdom he had come to establish here on earth, a kingdom that included the last group of people who believe that they are working to control this situation, as Brianna just shared a few moments ago with the kids, the disciples. Men who on that night found themselves tired, overcome, and overwhelmed by the news they had heard from Jesus, that all of these things would happen, that he would go and die. And so their fear and panic lead them to some impulsive actions to try to control what they can control on that night. Matthew records in verse 51 first that as the crowd is coming to arrest Jesus, one of his companions, and John's gospel would tell us it's Peter, cut off the ear of the servant of the high priest. This disciple, trying to control the situation with force, to exert power, to make a statement and push back those who were doing something he didn't agree with. And his friends weren't much better, because our passage ends with these words: then all the disciples deserted him and fled. Seeing what was going on, they choosing to see Jesus handed over as a loss for them personally. And so they sought to protect themselves before they too perhaps found themselves arrested by the mob. And so they ran away. Self-preservation over sacrifice. Using this opportunity to try to save themselves just after saying they would all stand with him no matter what would come, when he told them he would be handed over to die. As we look at this story in just these few verses of Matthew 26, we see many people seeking their way in what happened that night. We can be hard on these people for what they did, for thinking they were in control. We can look at the unplugged controllers in their hands, the silver coins, the swords and clubs, the power, the money, and see their inability to truly impact what was happening. We can think they were being ridiculous, but reflecting on our own lives, we can probably see examples of this in ourselves as well. Because we find ourselves in situations all the time where we try to control what's going on, to control what's happening, when it happens, how it happens, even who it happens to at times. We do these very same things. We use money to create a sense of security, to influence outcomes for ourselves. We give at times with strings attached. I'll help you, but you owe me for this. We spend to gain approval, buying things to fit in, to impress other people, to show how important we are. We withhold generosity, keeping tight control of what we have because we don't want to lack in this made-up situation that could come in the future. We prioritize having money over obedience to God, choosing financial comfort over what God is calling us to do. We also try to force outcomes through what we do, through our actions. We can think of times when we and others have chosen to manipulate situations, setting things and people up to get the results that we want, going into meetings and important discussions knowing we have the numbers, the votes around the table, taking matters into our own hands instead of waiting for God to work through. We overwork, doing things in our own strength to try and guarantee success. Friends, we still use our words to try to control people. Flattery with an agenda, guilt-tripping people, anger or intimidation, withholding the truth because it doesn't make us look good or it might go against the point that we're trying to make. And we still try to use our power or our influence for our own purposes. How many of us as parents, or perhaps even as leaders, have said, "Because I said so"? Dominating decisions instead of listening to those who are around the table. Using authority to protect our image rather than serve others. Silencing people who disagree with us. We can be like the people in this passage. Can be like my kids with the controller in their hands, thinking these things will bring us control over the situation, will get us what we want, not realizing they won't, they don't, that there's another plan in place, that all along there was someone else in control. Because as we flip back to our passage this morning, we read that while everyone else listed in this scripture thinks they're controlling what's going on in that garden, one person was actually in control from the very beginning. That from before the seeds of a plan were planted in their mind, his plan of salvation was already being worked out for all people. That Jesus was in control. Verse 46 tells us that Jesus knew what and who was coming and went out to meet them. He didn't think to hide even though he could. He didn't run away even though it was probably an option. He went to where the people were go to where the people were to protect himself. He willingly put himself in the place where they would find him in order to bring about the events of that night. This pivotal moment and event in human history. Jesus, in praying for God's will to be done, knew what needed to happen, and so set in motion himself that night, those events. He controlled every detail of what would happen, so it was a fulfillment of the prophecies about him from the Old Testament scriptures. He would be the suffering servant, Isaiah 52, the righteous sufferer, Psalm 22. He would be betrayed by a friend, as recorded in Psalm 41 and 9. He would be the struck shepherd, as Zechariah wrote in chapter 13 and verse 7, the rejected stone of God, Psalm 118 and 22. Jesus was in control of the situation, ensuring these prophecies would be complete in order to highlight for those who followed him that this was the plan all along. A plan that involved him handing himself over even though he had the power to do the opposite. Jesus speaks to this in verse 53 when he says he could call on the Father who would send 12 legions of angels to protect him. One legion, it's believed, would have been about 5,000 to 6,000 Roman soldiers. So Jesus is saying 60,000 plus angels would come to his defense at one call. A statement we see truth in. Because as we read his birth narrative in Luke 2, it talks about the sky being filled with a choir of angels singing praises to God. Even Satan acknowledges this power was available for Jesus when he challenged him to jump off the highest peak of the temple in Matthew chapter 4, saying, God will send his angels to catch you and lift you up if you call on his name. And his power was not just in being able to call angels either. Because all of these people gathered there that night would have known what Jesus could do. They would have seen him give sight to people born without it. Witnessed him making people walk who hadn't in decades, would have watched him drive out legions of demons possessing someone. They would have saw or heard that he brought someone back from the dead who'd been buried 4 days earlier. They all witnessed just moments before all of this, him putting someone's ear back on their head. But Jesus was demonstrating and not using his power, the power of control that he had over the situation. Choosing to let it happen for them, for you, and for me. And he showed his control over the situation through the lessons he was teaching while all of this was going on. Now, I'm sure there was a human part of Jesus that loved a little bit what Peter did. Probably appreciated his friend coming to bat for him and standing up for him, the protection that he provided. But Jesus, in teaching sacrifice over self-preservation, was showing them a new way, a new model to follow that was contrary to anything being taught in the world. A new way that they, as his believers, were supposed to follow in realizing that he was ultimately the one that was controlling what was happening. In control of that situation, in control of the one that was to come and the ones after that and after that and after that, and the ones before it leading to this point as well. That every situation from the beginning of time until the moment it is all done and over with is all under his control. Jesus demonstrated in our passage this morning that he is the one in control then, and friends, he's the one in control right now. That just as the devil could do nothing to Job without permission from God, there was nothing happening on that night that Jesus didn't approve or allow, and there is nothing happening now that happens outside of his will as well. Because there is still a plan. He is still on the throne, and he is still in control. Now, don't get me wrong, this doesn't mean that only good things will happen to us. Jesus' own story is evidence of this, because I don't want to ruin what's to come for you if you haven't read it yet. But Jesus goes through some stuff over the rest of that day. He'll be falsely accused. He'll be dragged around back and forth between places. He'll be whipped. He'll be beaten. He'll be mocked. He'll be spit on. He'll be struck. He'll be wounded. He'll be forced to carry his own cross. They'll nail him to it. They'll drive a crown of thorns on his head, and he will die. His story reminding us that human existence brings with it pain, loss, struggle, and hurt. All of those things well within his control, but part of the plan leading to the salvation of the people of his time. For each of those other people on that night, if they would believe, for all of us, if we choose to believe in him today. Who choose to acknowledge who he is and hand over to him control of the things in our lives completely. To not just give it to him when it aligns with what we want. To not just say we'll give him control when things are so messed up that we can't make sense of it anymore. Not just the parts we don't want to look after or the things that we don't care about, but to hand over everything to him. Wants and wishes, plans and purposes, time, talents and treasures, relationships and resources, life and livelihood. Everything we are and will be, we have or will ever have. That as his followers, we need to choose to hand over control to him. And then in doing that, to choose to follow his way over our own. To love God and others above ourselves. To love our friends who make it easy and our enemies who deserve something else. To care for the orphaned and the widowed, the hungry and the thirsty, the imprisoned and the sick. To humble ourselves, serving others instead of wanting them to serve us. Forgiving the unforgivable and loving the unlovable. To let go of every facet of our lives and trust the one who has been in control since before time began. The God of the universe who placed every star, planet, atom, and element perfectly where it needs to be for our existence. The personal God of love who knows your name. the number of hairs on your head, and who desires to be in relationship with you and I. To acknowledge today and every day that he is the one who truly controls it all, just as he did on that night. Friends, we need to lay down our controller, whatever that may be for you. Our desire to run things and let him have a turn. To trust him even when it doesn't make sense, as it didn't for many on that night. To believe that what is happening will be used for his glory, for his kingdom, even if it means personal loss for ourselves. That what he's calling us to and through will not be more than the grace he's offering, the strength he'll provide, the love that he will continue to show us. That no matter what we're going through, have going on, or will face in the days ahead, that we can be assured that he is the one in control of it all. And that in facing those situations, that we can ask ourselves this question: am I willing to stop trying to control and to submit to his plans for my life?